Great. Welcome again, everyone, to the State Efforts to Count All Kids webinar, Part 1. This is a webinar to share what state child advocacy groups are doing to help ensure that we count all kids in 2020. And we are doing this in partnership with the Casey Foundation's Kids Count project. And so I'm going to turn the webinar over now to Flo Gutierrez, who can talk a little bit about the Casey Foundation's role and introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As a foundation who's really focused on the well-being of kids, we want to make sure that all of our kids have an opportunity to grow up safe, that they can grow up healthy, and economically secure. We want to ensure that they have that strong foundation that will allow them to thrive into adulthood. We strongly believe that the undercount of young kids puts this overall mission at risk. It takes resources away from programs and services that are really critical for a child's development. These are resources that are necessary to ensure that all children grow up with a strong foundation. The census not only supports the distribution of funds for programs such as WIC, Head Start, and food stamps, but it also makes children's needs invisible in the eyes of government. If the government doesn't know you're there, they're not going to be providing services for you. And really, it's not only about the resources, it's about representation and our democracy and our ability to do what's right for our children. Now, because of all this, as a foundation, we are supporting the development of infrastructure at the national and state level to ensure that the undercount of kids is a priority and to make sure that we are poised to develop outreach plans, to develop strategies that are effective to count all kids in 2020. To this end, we are supporting the Partnership for America's Children as a national hub, and we're also supporting our Kids Count network and our partners at the state level to really start tackling the issue within their states. Now, this series of webinars will highlight the state level work. Our hope is that through these webinars, advocates, funders, and others at the state and local level obtain ideas on how they can engage in their communities and how they can make census a priority and effective where they live. And we strongly believe that at this moment, developing this infrastructure is critical in order to ensure a complete and accurate count in 2020. And we're hoping that everyone on this webinar agrees with us and joins us in those efforts. Now, today we have representatives from New York, from California, from North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas. Kate is leading the work in New York. We have Stacey Lee, who is taking on the efforts in California. Whitney Tucker, who is the research director at NC Child and is really taking a leadership role in the state. Ashawn McKenzie, who's leading the work in Ohio, and then we have Cassie Davis from Texas that's doing some great and innovative work there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kate to get us started. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. I am going to attempt to move the slides, and so you will see the first New York slide. The New York State Council on Children and Families is the Kids Count grantee, and we have been working on the census since 2017 in a governor's interagency work group, getting folks ready for the LUCA in New York State. And we learned about the undercount of children through the Annie E. Casey and the Leadership Council for Civil and Human Rights at the national level talking about the census. So we were very interested in this and to learn that it had been going on for decades, that this was not just a 2010 issue. So in order to understand that undercount better.
Here's all her stuff.
Deb, I'm just having a little trouble with the controls. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Sorry.
All right. So we wanted to better understand this undercount of children, so we organized parent focus groups with parents of young children. And we spoke with parents who have children enrolled in Head Start and Migrant Head Start and individuals involved with community action programs in New York. And young parents in low-income communities were our target audience, since many were unfamiliar with the census, not only because of their age, but also because they were living in hard-to-count communities, which was defined by the census and by the City University of New York as zip codes and census tracts that have not mailed back 100% of their census forms in the past. So we were interested in talking with folks from these communities. We centered our focus group listening sessions on messages that persuade individuals to complete the census, persons and organizations who are considered credible and trusted sources within their communities, and how these messages should be delivered so that they're visible with our intended audiences. Deb was incredibly wonderful and tweeted some of our findings, as well as I know she has our census brief up on her website. And so we were looking at some of the messages and things that parents were saying. So on the next slide, you can see Deb's tweets, and there's a takeaway from all of these messages. It's not so much about teachers versus lunch ladies, but it's about finding messengers who resonate authentically with the audience, and with whom do the audience most identify. So we here at the Council, we talk about reaching out to parents, reaching out to other providers throughout the state, and we have to remember that we are not our audience. Many of our kids are in their teens or college age. Some of us have no children, and we live in different parts of our community. So it's important to find out who we're targeting, families with young children, and who they will listen to, who resonates with them. And we found out that this is not personal to them. We need to make it personal. So to find out that school lunch is given to the states based on the census funding and how many children are in that area was very important for people. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that we tried to look at some communication strategies for how to get this right down to where people are. And you might not be surprised that people are very busy and they're negotiating hectic, stressful lives as young parents, as low-income families, and people frequently hold down more than one job. So they also felt in our focus groups that we needed an extended period of time to be talking about the census and to be making that connection to where the money comes into their community and how it supports their children. They were talking about people listen to the weatherman, which was great because today you may know or may not know that we are having an intense snowstorm. So everyone was indeed listening to the weatherman today, the weather women. So we want to get people who people listen to. We also want to find places where people are. So people said that Facebook was a huge part of how they got their news as young people, but that their parents or grandparents still listened to the local news at 6 o'clock. So we need to pay attention to these variations and these unique places where we're going to find people. And that we really need to send the message out more than once so that people know where the benefits are coming into their community. So the next slide talks about a little bit some of the inevitable barriers. You also may not be surprised to learn that people are not trusting of the government right now. They're afraid of the government. And this has definitely been something that the U.S. Census Bureau has been looking at. But people were also very candid about having issues in their homes that might complicate things, that might not, that it would influence their decision not to fill out the census. Family members who aren't citizens, siblings who are temporarily residing with relatives without the landlord's knowledge, family members who are getting out of jail. These were reasons given while people might not want to be honest, might not want to complete the census. And assurances that the information was confidential and would not be disclosed did not at all assuage the concerns in the room. Now, the council, next slide, has a very unique place in state government. We have a 40-year history serving as a broker, an innovator, a change agent among the state's health, education, and human service agencies. So that's our unique value, to bring together the state agencies to look at cross systems, to look at strategies that might impact the availability, accessibility, and quality of care. So the census fits right in that area, as we are part of the multi-agency work group from the governor's office. We are also very involved in early childhood in our state and some of the services for vulnerable children and youth. So we were able to be a part of that work from the New York State perspective. We were all very excited when the Attorney General announced that the judge had ruled for New York and the ACLU and 34 states, cities, and the Conference of Mayors, saying that the citizenship information should not be on the census. So we were very excited about that. We know it's continuing, so we're staying up to date on that. We're sending that information out to our partners and contacts also. Governor Cuomo has announced a state complete count commission to inform and help direct the activities in 2019 and 2020, and he is hoping to launch a massive outreach and education campaign. The next slide has our 2019 activities as the council. We are hoping to create a data resource that shows the relationship between child well-being indicators and the census funding. So again, making that connection for folks. The audience will be our consistent partners, child advocacy organizations, early childhood programs, our state agency partners with oversight for early childhood, and county leadership. With the Kids Count data, we often talk with county planners and other county leadership about data and child well-being, so they are also a natural partner with us. And we also hope to coordinate outreach efforts among all of the child-serving agencies, programs, and advocacy organizations for Census 2020 outreach in New York. Thank you, and I will pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. My name is Stacey Lee, and I'm Managing Director with Children Now. We are a children's research, advocacy, and policy organization based in California. We focus on children aged 0 to 26 and on all the areas that concern their well-being, including early childhood, education, child welfare, and health. Just to give you a sense of what's going on in California, I think one of the big stories about California and the census is just the scale of how many kids we have and the enormous diversity of the children and complexity of the households that children live in. So we have over 9 million children in California overall. And as you can see, just under 74% are children of color and are primarily under the age of 12. 43% are low income, and if you look at children under the age of 5, it's 62% are low income. The number on this chart shows that we have 1.3 children who are designated English learners in the public education system. But again, if you look at children before they enter kindergarten, the estimate is about 60% of children in California are dual language learners. So the story about California's children is that there's a lot of them. They're very diverse, and they have complex family and home situations that put them in many of the categories that are considered hard to count for the census. This map of California shows you the hard-to-count communities throughout our state. So you can see that it's not one size fits all. There's different levels of concentrations of communities that have more hard-to-count communities than others. If you look at the dark blue county here in the southern portion of California by the coast, that is our beloved LA County, of which I am a resident. It is the hardest to count county in the country. And part of that is because we have more people overall than 42 other states in terms of total population. And then we also have every hard-to-count community residing within the county. So because of that complexity, LA County has consistently been one of the hardest-to-count counties in California, and is also one of the reasons why we've had special organization and coordination activities happening in LA County, which I'll talk about later. The other point that I would bring up regarding California and what I showed in terms of our diversity and complexity in terms of our population is that while we have certain proportions of populations throughout the state, the concentrations of those populations vary widely across the state. So you might have a community that's 90% Latino in one area, or 50% Asian American, or 90% white. So it's very diverse when you go from region to region throughout the state. And some of our partners in the Census Coalition that I'll talk about next have talked about as well that some of their communities are concentrated in geographic areas and others are more spread out. So it just makes the outreach strategy vary by community. So one of the major efforts that has happened in California is that we've had a statewide policy coalition focused on the census going into year 3. So we're very proud of the early organization by all of these fantastic organizations throughout the state. We currently have 19 members, and they were intentionally brought to the table because they reflected and work closely in communities that are considered hard to count. So we have housing advocates, disability rights groups, LGBTQ, immigrant rights, refugee, Native American, and Latino, Asian American, and others, African American organization, and of course Children Now and the First 5 Association who focus on children and young children. The coalition has focused primarily on advocacy and funding for the census. We recognized early on that with the challenges happening at the federal administration, that it would be really important for California to step up and make sure there was leadership, coordination, funding, outreach happening at the state level. So in 2017-18 budget, we were able to garner $10 million, which was a great start to establish the beginnings of a committee at the state level and get the state thinking about staffing and organization for census activities. Last year, the push was much stronger, and we were able to get $90 million over 2 years, which is a great amount of money. And we always recognize in California things cost more, so it can look like a lot compared to perhaps what other states are investing. But just to give you an idea of that budget amount, the California Health Exchange, Cover California, spent $100 million in 1 year for marketing. So just to give you a contrast of potentially where there might be a shortfall. And the current budget proposal in the governor's budget released in January includes $54 million. So our coalition is very focused on the amount of funding that will go to community-based organizations because of the diversity of our communities and the high proportion of hard-to-count communities that we have. We recognize that those community organizations are trusted partners and neighbors and recognized leaders in their communities and would be some of the most effective spokespeople for reaching communities and educating folks about the census. So a lot of our advocacy is focused on the amount that's going to community-based organizations. So of the current amount available, just under $40 million is available for community-based organizations, and the RFQs have already been going out. But our coalition estimates we need over $100 million for CBO outreach. So we will be pushing for more in this current budget season. And then the other story about our coalition has been both working at the state level and then ensuring there's local engagement and planning. We've been in close coordination with various county agencies and leadership, particularly in LA County. Philanthropy has been involved both at the statewide and local levels. And we've been it's an all-hands-on-deck approach, reaching out to all of our stakeholders and organizations that we work with to make sure they're informed and are plugged in when there's opportunities to support an activity, whether it be a local training on census activity happening in their community or opportunities for them to apply to the RFQ for state funding, as well as garnering support for all of the wonderful state or federal advocacy opportunities that the national partners have been coordinating. We've been very excited and happy to contribute to all of the really well-coordinated advocacy happening at the federal level. So all of our partners are involved in that as well. And then in terms of Children Now specifically, as I mentioned, we do have government affairs staff focused on this in Sacramento. So we work closely with our coalition partners who have Sacramento-based staff and are in the hallways educating, advocating with folks. In the building, we're using all of our communications and social media to help amplify messages, both from our federal and state partners, about the importance of the census and opportunities to engage in advocacy. And Children Now coordinates what we call the Children's Movement, which is an initiative we created probably over 10 years ago at this point, to leverage the thousands of organizations in California that care about kids, that are child serving, that provide important services to children and families across the state, but haven't been leveraged effectively to voice their support and concern for children. So we are very proud that we have 3,000 members of the Children's Movement. And then if there's regional opportunities, we've been making sure that we target our members in LA County and other places to let them know about efforts to get involved or to speak up in their local community. So we really see our work as part of the AIR campaign for making sure there's outreach and information going out to folks, and then working closely with our partners who are building out pretty sophisticated ground and community outreach campaigns. We're also very proud to be a KC Kids Count partner in California and have worked closely to spread the message, particularly with the release of the data book this year, which focused on the census. So that's it for me in California. I'm going to pass it on to our next speaker, North Carolina.
Thank you so much. So again, my name is Whitney Tucker, and I'm Research Director at NC Child. So starting off just a little bit about NC Child, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan legislative advocacy organization that really works to promote policies that protect children's well-being, regardless of race, ethnicity, or place of birth. And we do that across a variety of areas. We don't really limit it to one aspect of children's well-being, and that keeps us in a pretty broad space with the legislature, but also really lets the census rise to the top of our list in terms of priorities, because it impacts so many different parts and pieces of our work in protecting the programs and the services that keep children doing their best in North Carolina. So quick background about the state in case you're not very familiar with North Carolina, we're a state with many hard-to-count communities, in large part due to really rampant poverty. About 46% of kids in North Carolina live under 200% federal poverty level, and 21% are at 100%. So in addition to that, everyone on this call may already know, but research has shown that urban and larger counties tend to have higher undercount rates of young children, and that really holds up for the most part in our state. Based on latest estimates, about 10% of North Carolina's current population lives in hard-to-count neighborhoods. That alone doesn't explain why we missed about 25,000 young children in our last census and are poised to miss about 73,000 young kids in hard-to-count areas now. Because in the 2010 census, in Wake County, which is where Raleigh, North Carolina is located, there was an undercount rate for young children of 6.3%. In Mecklenburg County, which is where Charlotte is, it was 5.3%, but in Durham, the undercount was only 1.7%. So we're really invested at NC Child in figuring out what went right and went wrong with the count of young kids in the census in 2010 to really perfect our messaging and get that out to communities so that they can help families figure out not only how to answer the census form, but why they should include everyone on the form, especially their young children. So in North Carolina, a total of just over $16 billion comes to the state based on the census count, and more than $5 billion of that is directly attributable to services for children. Obviously, if missed in the census, kids in hard-to-count communities stand to suffer the most from reductions in funding to vital programs as well, because those communities tend to be higher in poverty and also have families in more stressful and complicated living situations who really rely on those programs. In North Carolina, we have had in the past a really bad track record of counting young kids, and in 2000, an undercount actually led to inadequate funding for our CHIP program, so that eligible children were put on a waiting list, and they just had to go uninsured until additional funding was found. We're really trying to avoid that moving forward because in the meantime, we have grown as a state, and we have particularly had a really large influx of young Latino children who are among the most undercounted nationwide because they are within a racial or ethnic group that's largely undercounted, and also because of their age group. That combined with complicated living situations that are often multi-generational, and also for some families, the fact that they are migrant or like that the household heads are migrant workers has made it really difficult for us right now to figure out exactly how and where we need to be reaching out. But we know that there is a much larger Latino population right now than there was in the last census, and that's going to be something that we're going to have to put a big focus on, because about 18% of our young kids, so 0 to 5, are Hispanic or Latino in North Carolina now. So all of that is really just background. In the meantime, as we've tried to prepare for the census, NC Child pushed with our partners to get a statewide complete count commission established, and was actually successful in that last October. Our governor established a commission by executive order, but before that was happening, there was sort of an informal coalition of groups that were working to move forward census advocacy without the state until the state established a commission. That group is often called the North Carolina Census Task Force. And since the commission has been established, the task force has been sort of the worker bees connecting local organizations that were just getting started with the state level commission. When the commission was first being established, our coalition really pushed for appointments of diverse early childhood voices in a way that we felt was kind of soft and not as public, because we wanted to focus on behind the scenes advocacy so that the governor would really appoint people who are able to represent the needs and interests of young children when we talked about census advocacy, without necessarily feeling shamed into appointing folks who are really well suited and positioned to not only develop messaging but spread it out to communities. So we really emphasized often that young children were missed in the past and that it had a negative effect on state funding. And to this particular administration, because we have a Democratic governor in North Carolina, we also focused on the aspect of congressional representation having been missed, because some estimates say that if North Carolina had counted the 25,000 young kids that they missed in the last census, we would have gained another seat in Congress. And then we proposed people who work on children's issues as those whose perspectives would be particularly helpful in overcoming those challenges. So the North Carolina Complete Count Commission now has 3 early childhood advocates, including myself, the communications director of the North Carolina Partnership for Children, which is an early education organization, and then the president and CEO of Albemarle Alliance for Children and Families, which is a local child and family services organization within one of the counties. And on the slide, I just illustrated sort of our soft approaches to that advocacy that I mentioned. So sharing fact sheets and blog posts with folks in the governor's office and among early childhood groups and on listservs and that sort of thing, but then also staggered phone calls from different folks who were all working within the task force but at different agencies, so that the governor's office was getting calls basically every week asking about if the commission was being established, if anyone with young children in mind was thinking it was being considered for an appointment, just kind of over and over again. And then also in-person meetings with the governor's office staff. For those of us who do talk directly with them often, we just started bringing it up more often face-to-face so that they were sort of hearing it all the time. So the state commission is now pretty well established. We have a logo, we have a website, but we still don't have any funding. Last session, our governor put in a request for $1.5 million for census funding, which after California doesn't seem like very much, but in North Carolina is a pretty considerable amount, especially also considering our current legislature. But as of right now, that request was rejected in the last session, and the governor's budget is still being prepared, and we're hoping that this time that request will be accepted now that we have some new legislators. But in the meantime, while the commission tries to get its footing and determine an unfunded outreach strategy, the North Carolina Census Task Force, which consists of NC Child, NALEO, and NC Counts Coalition, we've really worked to keep Census 2020 in the forefront of community leaders' minds. So a couple of weeks ago, the North Carolina Counts Coalition held a statewide convening of state and national speakers on the census, and that was attended by about 200 potential advocates for a complete count, which included a large number of state employees who were just coming for additional information and to figure out how this affects them and what they should be doing about it within their roles. So that was really exciting. NC Child has also worked to make sure that we don't really get behind the ball in terms of things we could be doing to reach out to local communities by leveraging North Carolina, especially the Triangle's real strength of having a lot of university-educated students and faculty who are interested in new projects, by enlisting graduate students from the University of North Carolina to conduct statewide mapping of local complete count committees, to then catalog their organization type that really brought those committees together. So whether it's faith-based, government, or nonprofit, who's really at the head of that committee, and then also contact information so that when the commission is funded, if it is funded, that the commission can then coordinate their efforts with those groups. And even if it remains unfunded, that they have somewhere to start. Because as a member of our Complete Count Commission in North Carolina, I can say that most of the folks who are on the commission do great community level work, but are unfamiliar with issues of the census, especially are unfamiliar with issues that are posed to the families of young children, and really are kind of scrambling to see where we should start. And without funding, our government partners are, slow on the uptake because I think that they want to see what sort of strategy they need to be going after, and it's still going to take a couple of months for us to see how that plays out with our budget here in North Carolina. So in addition to those efforts, NC Child has been publishing fact sheets and blog posts and social media posts on the undercount of young kids. And we're actually publishing on the 28th an issue brief on the young child undercount specifically related to young Latino children in partnership with NALEO. And that's all being shared with the Complete Count Commission through my involvement. And because the commission hasn't had any coordinated work yet of its own, those materials are being the only materials that are circulated, so it's getting this issue out in front of a broader audience who's never actually heard of it before, and it doesn't have any competition for their attention. So it's really great. Folks are clamoring for content and to be asked to do something. And right now, I think that early childhood advocates are really in a perfect place to be the voice that answers them in North Carolina. So our priority at NC Child at this point forward is securing state funding for the complete count efforts. I already mentioned the governor's request that was rejected before, but I've just listed here just generally some of the aspects of the Young Child Undercount that have gotten attention from the different groups that we've been reaching out to help us advocate for more funding. Legislative staff, we've really talked a lot about how much other states are funding their census work and sort of playing up the idea of us not wanting to fall behind and have to catch up to the work that's done in other states, because other people are going to end up with representation that is reflective of their populations when North Carolina won't. And then also how historically our state has done a poor job of counting young kids. With early childhood advocates, who are also very interested in this issue, but usually in our experience haven't really done any sort of advocacy around the census, we've really been talking a lot about how much funding is at stake for each program that they are familiar with that is tied into the census count. And then with county and municipal government heads, we've talked a lot about hard-to-count populations in their area, and then the fact that in many of our counties there's been a lot of population growth since the last census, and how that will not be reflected in the census count if we don't work more now and get funding now to reach out to communities and make sure that we get an accurate count, and that then we're going to keep having local governments strain to meet the needs of a growing population that the government really won't know is there. And so this sheet is my last slide. It's just sort of a quick cheat sheet that we made that I include on most of our PowerPoints now, but just about the resources that we've been directing people to in the meantime. The first is the North Carolina Census official state site for the Complete Count Commission, and this is the logo that we're going to be using for 2020. And then down in the middle, you see a little picture of the fact sheets that we've created, one on the young child undercount and why young children are undercounted, and then another that talks about all of the money that's at stake in the state if we don't count young kids, and how that works and how that money comes to the state for people who are really unfamiliar with it. And then the last is obviously the Count All Kids site, which Deb runs and does a really great job with, and provides lots of blog posts and resources to folks specifically about the young child undercount that we have found have been really helpful to our potential advocates that we've been reaching out to, and which people really like to share on social media. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and push it on over to Ohio.
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. So good afternoon. My name is Sean McKenzie. I'm here with the Children's Defense Fund Ohio as our policy director, and to share a little bit about our organization. We're a nonprofit policy advocacy and research organization focused on a variety of children's issues. I'm going to share a little bit about the work we've done building up our census coalition that we launched at the beginning of last year, along with a little bit about our advocacy with our state policymakers in particular, and some of our initial communication efforts. So this is just a quick snapshot of kind of the way that we put things together. We spent some real time to kind of organize our structure.
What? Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. To try to organize, we spent some time to make sure we had a nice organized structure that helped clarify roles and goals for everybody, but also helped make it simple as we tried to work on our development efforts. And really what we've been kind of aiming to do is sort of, not necessarily be the only entity around us that's working on the census or anything like that, but to really work hard to pull all of our various different organizations and entities who are focused and who are working on the census sort of together to do, to build our strategic plan together and our work plans together. And I think we've been pretty effective at, trying to pull in, pretty much everyone we can find that had an interest in doing this work, and especially those with funding or who are seeking funding. And we've been able to take a really nice coordinated strategy that in some ways has been paying off to some degree. But you'll see where we have sort of our executive team that where a lot of the work happens, steering committee, and then our work groups, which we're focused on our communications, local outreach, which really get out the count, and then our advocacy at the state, federal, and local levels. So to chit-chat a little bit about some of our state and local advocacy, we set out to try. So Ohio, we have a brand new governor, and all new cabinet staff, and so we've been working because there's a unique opportunity here where there's an extended amount of time for the governor to introduce his budget, and so we've been working to try to get our recommendations for what our state needs for funding to support census efforts, or at least a portion of that, into the governor's budget. And we do not yet have a state complete count committee, as a number of other states deal with. Our gubernatorial election always falls in the year where you really want your state to be putting together a committee, and so in years past, one of two things happened. Either no committee was put together before the election of a new governor, or a committee was put together and every action that they took was suspicious or what seemed was suspected to be political. And so in any event, what happened this year is no action was taken. And so we're still waiting, and we're still pushing and promoting for our governor to establish our state complete count commission. But the other thing that we realized is because of that, because we always run into that issue, our gubernatorial election always falls in sort of a bad time for preparing for the census. Part of what we're hoping and pushing for our leaders to take a look at is anything that we can do that helps with our long-term infrastructure, triggering language and legislation about, when these things can start being put together. And so in any event, that's one of the things we're pushing our leaders to take a look at and to build an Ohio solution for. So a couple of things I want to highlight is that we're really happy about the fact that children are so high on the radar of our new governor, to the point where his first cabinet level appointee was a brand new office he created, the Director of Children's Initiatives. And so we've been building up a relationship with that individual in one of her previous roles, which was very similar, and very happy to have her in this role now. And so one of the things that we've worked hard to do, so really a multi-part strategy, but we've been working to get similar messaging and similar positions, not only with the coalition, this Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition, but with a number of other coalitions that we're a part of. And so we also lead a children's budget coalition in which we composed an issue brief focused on the census and organized a legislative briefing with all of our children's budget partners, but had a great amount of time to share and talk with our new Director of Children's Initiatives about the census. And at that time, it was a really brand new issue that they found a lot of interest and fascination with. In addition, we've been scheduling and setting down some meetings with some of the other various cabinet members through our coalition and our partners, and got an invitation to make a recommendation about what our state needs to financially to have a robust census effort. So what we ended up helping our partners compose was essentially a multi-layered approach where first tier, what we felt like our state needs to look at with staffing for our state complete count commission and some support for our hard to count communities. Our overall ask looked like $2.5 million. And then we broke that down into layers based off of where the state might end up being comfortable. And Ohio's a state that has not made a state level investment in the census effort. We had zero investment in 2010, zero in 2000. Not much of a record for what our investments looked like before that. And even some initial conversations with our cabinet leadership sort of indicated just a little bit of shock almost about, seeking out state funding to support census efforts. So, we really tried to take that tiered approach so that they had options as they considered what they would deem appropriate for placement in the governor's budget. And, recognizing that we and our partners will need to kind of make up the difference with our legislative advocacy later on. So in any event, we've been really effective at getting a number of other coalitions and aligning the agenda amongst our different partners, so that the language, the wording, and the priorities that we set forth for our state for the census, as well as what we suggest as the amount of money a state needs to have a robust effort, has been integrated not only within our coalition, but in a number of other coalitions who have also been making contact with the governor's office, cabinet-level leaders, as well as our legislative leadership. The other thing I'll speak a little bit about here is our communication efforts. And a major aspect of our communication efforts being our census solution workshop approach. So as you saw in kind of one of the previous slides, communications is a key part of our coalition efforts. And some of you may have gotten a chance to sit through some of the workshops at the Institute last fall. But the Census Bureau recommends census solution workshops as a neat way to engage communities, to get some folks to make some early commitments about what participation they'll have in the census and in promoting it. We're taking a special step here, and so what we're actually doing is we worked with the Census Bureau and used a number of the existing mapping tools, as well as suggestions and insights from a number of our different community leaders locally about specific communities specific hard-to-count communities and their locations. We sought out community leaders who are trusted messengers in these locations and with these various communities, and we're bringing all those folks to Columbus for a training on design thinking facilitation, and we'll be deploying them back to their communities and providing support for them to host their own census solution workshops within their communities. We're working together with not only a design firm to help with that training, but also a communications firm to help us narrow down what type of insights will be sort of most helpful as we build out our communication and messaging planning, as well as those materials. And so what we'll be doing is not only hosting or assisting with the hosting of about 25 census solution workshops throughout the state, but also gathering back insights from those and tailoring some ways to capture some of the information of those workshops so that they can be leveraged for our state communication plans. There are a number of other kind of exciting things to share and talk about, but I try to keep it a little bit narrow here considering our time. So I'll go ahead and wrap there and pass the baton along to our friends in Texas.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cassie Davis. I'm with Center for Public Policy Priorities. We are an independent public policy organization that uses data and facts to lead our work. And we are part of the SCP network and also a Kids Count site. So happy to be doing the census work. So because of time, I'm not going to get super into, everything about Texas, but this is one of the main graphics that we have been using to really communicate to community advocates, local leaders, and state leaders, what are like the three buckets of why this matters. So Texas stands to lose at least $300 million per year if we're undercounted by just 1%, and that's from the George W. Study. And then going into our kids, so let's talk a little bit about what happened in 2010. So in 2010, about 7.4% of children under 5 in Texas, which is around 155,000 children, were missed. And in Texas, which is a predominantly Latino population, or has a very growing Latino population, almost half of the young children that were missed were Latino. So 75,000 children Latino children were missed. And we know that based on some research from Dr. O'Hare, the Latino children are twice as likely to be undercounted than non-Hispanic white children. And we had two of our largest counties, Dallas and Harris County, had some of the highest net undercounts of young Latino children across the nation in 2010. So getting into the 2020 census, 30% of our children under 5 are at risk of being missed in the 2020 census. And a majority of Texas children live in metropolitan areas. And as noted earlier in the presentation, the larger the county, the higher risk of an undercount. And currently, today, 50% of our children under 5 are Latino. So I did just present at NALEO, so a lot of my facts may be Latino specific, but I think that's really important that half of our children that are young are Latino. They're also overrepresented in high poverty neighborhoods, and 25% of Texas children live in families with at least one non-citizen parent. That's a lot, especially given the climate around this census. So some of the main challenges that you can see on our hard-to-count map here is Texas is large. Texas is very large. It's very geographically spaced, and one solution doesn't work in one region, and another solution doesn't work well in another region. So basically, we're having to really, at the state level, look at, okay, well, what can we do as a state? But it really is going to be key that we're working with direct service providers and community-based organizations in those localities. And then also something that's been a challenge has been there's an education gap. Really here at CCCC, we've been leading those educational meetings with lawmakers, local and state, as well as other community-based organizations and direct services, and it's been really great. But we have noticed that, there are some folks, especially at our state legislature, who are unsure of what their role is in the census at the state. They think it's a federal issue, and so just having to educate them on, okay, well, why should we do census outreach at the state level, and why should we fund that, has been kind of something that we've been working on. And to get in specifics, just real fast, at the state level, our state strategy is really focused on establishing a statewide complete count committee, and as well as secure funding, similar to other states on this call. So we actually have Representative Cesar Blanco, is a Texas House representative from El Paso, and he has filed HB 255, and that would establish a statewide complete count committee, also establish the call for a robust 2020 census plan to be submitted by the end of the year, and then also a grant program that would allow for funds from private donations, and then give them out as local grants to local governments to further their outreach efforts. In terms of funding, we are a conservative state. I know some states also mentioned they hadn't had much infrastructure in the past around the census. Texas actually had governors in the past that have committed to a census count, or at least to a complete count committee. They were established kind of close to the census day, but they still were established, and they were both Republican governors. So, we bring that point up a lot to our legislators, that we're just, very, we have done this in the past. We established a complete count committee, we should do it again. And in terms of funding, we have not put dollars toward the census outreach efforts in the history of Texas. So we are looking at some funding numbers based off the STI report, but we also, from a state strategy perspective, we know we're a conservative city. We haven't put dollars to that before. There's an education gap. So we're kind of asking for a more $5 to $10 million per dollar range. And we've been testifying and also been mobilizing some of our partners that have come on board to also testify in appropriations and finance hearings this session. And then going a bit into localities, I'll probably just skim through the localities, but essentially we do know that a lot of larger metro areas, such as San Antonio, Houston, Austin, Dallas, El Paso, have established complete count committees and are in the process of getting those to work, and as well as another area called the Rio Grande Valley, which is the southernmost part of Texas, and that includes a lot of small municipalities. that all are really, they're pretty segregated from the rest of the state. There's only one highway that goes in. It's pretty rural, and it's also the border. So you might have heard a lot about it on the news. But I just want to give a quick example of them, because I think that what they're doing down there and advocating for themselves is really important and really great to share. So Hidalgo County, their county judge Garcia, who is the former county judge, he just stepped down, really led the effort in getting census work off the ground. Back in 2010, the Rio Grande Valley did not have a great experience getting counted, so much so that there was a lawsuit after. They have what's called colonias in their area, and those are unincorporated housing groups, essentially, that don't have, city services. And so a lot of them have P.O. boxes, and the Census Bureau was not delivering surveys to P.O. boxes, and this upcoming census they also are not. So that was kind of a challenge, and just things went not well in 2010. So in order to get ahead of things, they actually did LUCA, and they found 16,000 corrected addresses and 15,000 new addresses. So if we just think that there's 4 people in those households of the corrected and new addresses, that they uncovered 100,000 more residents to be accounted for. And so they also have a really great local complete count committee that has subcommittees. And specifically relating to kids, they have an education subcommittee where their ISDs have committed to putting the printed flyers that they are going to produce into every kid's school backpack. And, last time in 2010, they used the national message coming from the Census Bureau. But, given what happened, going into 2020, they have really took on a more tailored message and even had a logo contest for their residents, where 500 residents participated in this. And so it's really community-led, and I think that that's super important, especially in large states or rural states or states that really need trusted messengers. They're doing that. And then last, because I know we're almost at time, CPPP and Texans Care for Children, one of our partners here in Texas, we were just awarded a grant. And so on our area, we are the data and resource hub. That's what CPPP serves. And so we will be looking for where hard-to-count areas are and where children under 5 are, and working with Texans Care for Children, who works with early child care providers, to develop resources to go directly home with children and their families, to educate them on both how important the census is and make sure that they count their children. And so some other things, just last note, we've been connecting with Texas agencies such as the Family Protective Services, who works a lot in the community, such as the caseworkers. And also we have some really great partners here that constantly come to testify or wanting to get involved. NALDEF, Children's Defense Fund Texas, NALEO, JOLT, Mi Familia Loca, and then, of course, Texans Care for Children. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, all of you. I hope you all are as excited as I am by the things that are happening. I do want to mention that we have 2 more webinars coming up, and they will cover very different topics. So even though you joined us for this webinar, I encourage you to come back for our webinars on February 20th and 25th. This is a list of some of the different aspects of state-level advocacy around the census that we'll be covering on our next webinar. And we will send out the slides and the recording after this webinar, along with some of the materials that were mentioned in the Q&A chat box. We unfortunately, it does not look like we have time for questions, but if you have questions that did not get answered, I encourage you to email me and I'll get you one. Whoops, I'm not quite sure why Cassie's slide is there. In the meantime, thank you all very much for joining us, and I look forward to having you join us again on February 20th. And I hope that you found this inspiring and useful. Have a great day.